All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Bottom Line Podcast, where we say what we mean and we mean what we say, because at the core of everything that is, was, and forever will be, there will always be the bottom line. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm taking you out to Australia. I'm taking you out to Sydney, Australia, to be specific. And my guest today is a phenomenal cybersecurity person, but also just like a straight shooter, which is why I asked her to come on and be a guest on the Bottom Line Podcast. Today's guest is Miss Karissa A. Breen of KBI, Karissa Breen Industries. Karissa here is the CEO and owner of KBI, Karissa Breen Industries. Now, before we got on, she said the funniest thing. Tommy Hill you wouldn't call Tommy Hill, right? And ask Tommy Hill to make you a shirt. So KB here, we call her KB, right? Is a startup builder, and what she focuses on is bridging the gap between technical and business. All right, and she's doing that out in Australia. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of her accolades. Okay, not only is she the CEO of KBI, she also specializes in cybersecurity and technology companies. Right now, this is directly on her LinkedIn profile. Look her up, because if you're in the space of a startup, in a tech startup space, you want to follow her content, so you have a better idea of what to expect in that terrain. Okay, so she works directly with tech startups, and she established technology enterprises to grow exponentially in today's rapidly shifting market. And I think that's where we are right now. There's a rapid shift. She also develops strategic content to take your message into the world so you can connect and build trust with your audience. Now, I just want to go back a little bit. KB, before you became KBI and everything else that's going on right now, how have you been doing with this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think I was actually on my way, I was traveling overseas. So before we went away, which was in February, the pandemic sort of started to become more prominent and in terms of people talking about it. But again, I like to be very optimistic. I'm not a pessimist, and I like to really focus on, it's in other countries. It hasn't quite come to Australia yet. Yeah. But I think the closer we got to the date of traveling, it became a little bit more intense in terms of what the media was saying, other people that you were talking to. Yeah. And so I traveled overseas to India, and then we came back there. Admittedly, there was no quarantine, but then after around 2 weeks of being back in Sydney, things started to go downhill pretty rapidly, and like all my conferences were cancelled and people just weren't meeting face to face. I wouldn't say I was worried. Yeah. And the reasoning for that is because I've been through catastrophic events. Where I was originally born in Australia, is the top part of Australia, a place called Townsville, where they have like a lot of cyclones and stuff like that. So to me, I thought, yes, it was worrying because it was uncharted waters, but I wouldn't say I was afraid. Yeah. However, I think that I could see people around me getting worried and afraid about, well, what does their life look like? What does their businesses look like? What do their jobs look like? So I could see that uncertainty, which in fact, potentially to some cases did project onto me. But I think that I was just very true in saying, well, I'm just going to focus on delivering work and focusing on that, because at least that's going to keep my mind quite preoccupied.
Yeah. So it sounds like, all right. So that's I think that's more or less the take that I got on it too, right? Like I got the same it had the same impact on me, I'm excited to have you on the show right now, because the tech space is doing really well, right? And I think with Zoom and us digitizing our businesses and, being more virtual, and look, you're in Australia, right? I'm out here in the States, and we're able to connect via Zoom, right? That's incredible, right? So before we really get into, how you came up with the idea to start your own business, your own tech cybersecurity business, I want to get an idea of how you've had to make changes, right? Like before, we connected. As I'm following you on LinkedIn, you're doing a lot of speaking engagements. You're doing a lot of firesides. You're doing a lot of keynotes. You're doing a lot of, Q&As. There's a lot of, you have a lot going on, right? I'm wondering how you've had to pivot, how you've had to change since all of this has been going on.
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. And I think that, and I don't like to say I was ahead of the curve, but I think when I created the business 3 years ago, and from the inception of that, I came up with this whole decentralized model, which means that staff don't have to work on site in Australia. And the reasoning for that is to find talent and capability with a technical skill set as well as a creative skill set was really, really hard to find. So it's not like it's a commoditized skill set. Had to go out throughout the world to find these people. And to give you sort of a little bit of perspective, we actually have a really strong technical writer, and she actually lives in Uganda in Africa, and she's amazing.
Wow.
And so we found her through Africa. Oh my God. We found her through Twitter, through an African networking group. And so she's amazing, right? So for me, all these people are like, oh, what am I going to do? I have to work remotely.
Right.
For us, it was like, yeah, cool. Okay. We sort of just got rid of our office and then just started working from home. So for us, we had built the company of work from anywhere, not just work from home, but work from anywhere, and have systems, processes, and policies to support that. And also because we are growing, we've got staff in the United Kingdom as well.
Really?
And we've got people all over Australia as well. So people are everywhere, right? And it doesn't really matter where someone lives as long as they can do the job and do it well. To me, that's all that mattered.
Yeah.
And what I think was the shift in a lot of other people is that they had to think, or they were forced to think about a different mindset. Well, how do we actually get people to do their jobs? I'm very outcomes based. I think if you're not focusing on outcomes and you're too much micromanaging people, you don't have enough work to do.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. So part of what I'm wondering is, okay, so you pretty much had some foresight to say, you know what, I want to create a business that is going to be international. It sounds like. One, two, you had the foresight to say, I want people to, not only be working remotely, but to be outcome driven like you are, right?
Yep.
And so because of that, you're not micromanaging, and you're not, of course you have a lot to do, but then, it does fall down to like individual responsibility when you think that way, right? Because there's a level of autonomy and there's a level of autonomy support, right?
Yes.
That's going to be necessary. What I'm wondering with you specifically, and this is the crazy part, right? For me, in your world, it doesn't seem like you are hands-on with what's going on with your company itself. You're more, to me, when I see your content, I see that you're more relationship centered. You're more working with people hands-on, answering questions, going to events, doing a lot of networking, more marketing yourself, branding yourself, right? So how has that changed since you've had to be more remote?
Look, I don't know if anything's really changed. I think like a lot of our business, we've got 100% of our business through LinkedIn, referrals, any sort of social networking platform. So people who are not marketing themselves online now are forced to. Again, we sort of started this quite early to the curve, and when LinkedIn was really at its prime, right? Like, so back in the day, I think when you and I are probably originally connected, like LinkedIn was huge back then. The reach has changed, and it's not the same as it used to be. However, it's still quite effective. So in terms of the shift, for me, a lot of people just shied away, whereas I'm like, I'm going to go full steam ahead. So we got more podcasts out, more content, being highly visible. We didn't want to feel like we were afraid, because if we showed that we were afraid, a lot of people were like, well, I don't going to trust these guys to run my stuff, because like they don't know what they're doing. So I think a lot of people ran away from the fire, whereas I ran straight through it.
Love that. And what's crazy is I can actually see that in your content, right? And again, you're not afraid of it. So the reason I'm asking that question is because I know it's going to be hard for you, Karissa. Just bear with me here, right? I know it's going to be hard for you to like go backwards, but there are a lot of people that I'm dealing with right now that they're having, when it comes to visibility, when it comes to creating their brand and understanding the difference between marketing and branding, when it comes to, taking on and then going through this shift right now, right?
Yeah.
What are some basic steps, right, that you took that were probably, I want to say just really instinctual for you, right? But might be a little bit hard for people who are not familiar. What are some basic steps besides, content that people can take just to get more visibility? What would you say?
Yeah, look, there's a strategy in marketing called OPN, which is other people's networks, right? So I'm coming on your podcast now. I guess the benefit to going on other people's podcasts is that when they deploy that podcast, that their network you're going to be seen then on. So
Yeah.
I think that if you're a little bit more afraid to sort of be front and center, and I get that, I think doing podcasts as guests, so similar to potentially coming on your podcast, you start to get used to it. You start to build your confidence. You start to build your credibility, because if you're being seen everywhere, right, you have that trust factor then. You must be good at what you do because you're on so many different podcasts. If you weren't good at it, people wouldn't ask you. So I think that to remove that whole, I feel afraid, I'm shy, just start going out into your network. You can either ask people, hey, I'd really love to be a guest, or eventually when you start building your profile, people just approach you, and then it's sort of the work does itself. Like, you don't have to really think about going out there and trying to sell yourself to get on people's podcasts. So I think that that's a really good first step to ensure that you're not afraid of being out there online. And it's an easy one as well, and it does pay dividends. However, it does take time to work. Like, just because you're on someone's podcast doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get like a massive deal. But in saying that as well, it's really hard to attribute where a lot of your deals then come from, in terms of, well, people just seeing you online, and eventually it's accumulative and people will come and approach you.
Right. I like that. I think that's big, because it's all centered around engaging, right? Like, how much are you engaging with people? How are you engaging with people, right? And how visible are you, right? I think all of that is centered around engaging. The other thing too that I'm hearing you say is that you respect the process, man. It's going to be a process. It's going to take some time. You got to respect the process. Go through the process. Don't expect to have immediate results, right? It takes some time. So, what attracted me to your content, Karissa, is how straightforward you are. You're very direct. You're very bottom line. And it's very hard to confuse or to overcomplicate. Cybersecurity does sound really complicated when you think about it. You think of Robert Herjavec over on like Shark Tank, right? And he's like cybersecurity mogul, you know what I mean? And so I'm not somebody who's really, when it comes to tech, I want to say I can get by. I'm not going to go beyond my, my level of understanding. I'd probably be the kind of person to outsource that, right? Hire somebody who's an expert in that area, let that person deal with it. And then that person, like you, can like school me on what I need to know so I can maintain it, right? You also said something about, and that's what attracted me to your content, right? You also said something about running right into the fire, right? That right there is real. That's real, because a lot of people are afraid to do that. So it brings me back to like, okay, Karissa, when did you become this kind of person that just goes head first and just, takes on the risk? You're not risk averse. Is this something that you've always been like? You've always been this way, or is this something you've been like this as a child? Like, what kind of kid were you?
I think I'm going to answer that two ways. So as a kid, yes, I was. I was speaking to my nana the other day, so my dad's mom, and she was just like, you've always been like that. Like, she goes, even as a kid, Karissa, like, no one wanted to cross you. You just give this look, and people could just read your look like you just were not impressed. I was like, that's really interesting.
Wow.
But then I was also on the other side, I was a very, very shy kid. And when I say that at conferences today, like, I even had someone call out from the audience to be like, no way, you were never shy. And I'm just like, I was. So I think I've gone through like ebbs and flows on terms of, yes, I was shy, but I wasn't. I've always been very, very strong in what my beliefs were. And I've always sort of had this theory of, if I think something, that's what I think. As I've gotten older, I've learned that life is not so black and white. There is the gray. As a child, it was a very binary, yes, no, that's it. There was no maybe so. And so now I'm learning that things are not so straightforward like that. That's coming with time, maturity, emotional intelligence. But then I think in terms of how that sort of came about, if I think about my dad is like very direct. He doesn't say much, but he's very, very direct. And I think the Breen side of it, which is obviously my dad's family, they're all very similar like that. They don't hold any prisoners. They do expect a lot. So I think that hard work ethic really was derived from my dad, but also my mum's family as well. I guess on both sides of my family, they came out to Australia from Italy and Ireland. So I'm the third generation born here, but they migrated to Australia to do cane cutting. And the reasoning for that was because a lot of Australians didn't want to do that type of work. So that in itself is quite hard work. It's long, it's tiring. And both sides of my family growing up had cane farms. when that was quite a very, very popular and profitable industry.
Yeah.
And so I think that when I think about my dad as well, I remember growing up as a kid and I hate the cold, right? So I love when I went to New York, for example, it was so cold there, but I love New York. So it kind of offset the cold part of it. But as I said, I'm from the north part of Australia, which is really, really hot. It's closer to the equator. So I like the heat more and I do better in the heat.
Right.
And as a kid, I remember saying to my dad, like, aren't you cold? He was like, I just say to myself, I'm not cold, and then I'm not cold. I'm like, what the hell is that?
Right.
And then immediately speaking to my mum, she was like, your dad has the mindset of an athlete. Like, he is just next level crazy. And we actually work on a tech startup together. And it's really interesting to see his mindset. Like, I've never met anyone that is so like a dog with a bone that just keeps going and going and going and going.
Right.
And even when I started the company, right, he was like, I said to him, oh, I'm a bit tired. He's like, what are you talking about? He's like, just go get a coffee and go back. Because you never, ever, 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 ever give up.
Nice.
And like, when I talk to other people like that, like phraseology isn't like normal, like in terms of what other parents would say to their kids. So I guess my family growing up, they were tough. And they were firm, but they were fair. They weren't unfair. They were very, very supportive of everything, but they were tough. And I think that because my parents, mum and dad, are very, very tough humans, I felt that sort of effectively transitioned this tough willpower about me. And I don't think if I had that sort of upbringing today, I don't think I'd be in the position that I am.
Right. I love it. You know what? I have a 5-year-old daughter, and when I'm soft on her, she looks at me like I have 3 heads. She expects me to be tough on her. It's the funniest thing. And she's only 5, right? I think she's kind of gotten used to it. Not only that, she sees how I am with her brother, which is 8, right? So, and that's the way I grew up too. Like, I grew up that way. I grew up in a more stern, tough love kind of environment. You know what I mean? So for me, I think, I'm watching 2 things. I'm watching the snowflake culture that we're in now, where people are more like, participating, and they should get a tap, like maybe a pat on their back for participating in something, right? Or taking a half step, right? Like, I hate to say, like, they half-ass their approach to whatever it is, right? And then it's kind of like, well, when you fail, it's because you weren't all in. You got 1 foot in, you got 1 foot out, right? And then they just, this whole thing is like, oh, it's exhausting. Entrepreneurship demands, it's not that it requires, it demands a majority of your time in the very beginning. Right. So you'll go through,
100%.
right? Like, you'll go through a few relationships. You'll go through a lot of arguments. You'll go through a lot of, like, I think what's the most important is you'll go through a lot of like personal development, right?
Mm-hmm.
You build tougher skin. So had it not been for your dad, being tough on you when you were younger, like you said, you probably wouldn't be in the position that you are in now. But I'm curious too, like, do you have any siblings, maybe brothers, or are you the only child?
No, I've got an older brother actually who works at Microsoft, so he's also in IT. It's very different to me. I wouldn't say that he wasn't tough, but he's not like me.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting, a few months ago, his manager at the time came to me on LinkedIn and said, I want to, like, what's a funny story between you and your brother Josh in terms of growing up?
Yeah.
And the story that I gave, and bless my brother's soul, like, he 100% back in the day was a hypochondriac.
Yeah.
And we are 3.5/4 years difference, right?
Okay.
Similar to your 2 kids, actually. And I remember, like, my brother may have been like, I don't know, 9 and I was like 5. And I remember him just saying, like, am I going to die from this? If I do this, will I die from it? If I eat that, will I die?
Right.
And one day I got so jacked, I said, I don't know. I'm 5. You're the older one. You should know.
Right.
That explains our relationship.
Yeah, I love it. The reason I'm asking is because it doesn't seem like your dad was partial at all with the whole, well, you're a girl and, he's a boy. Like, it sounds like, it was, it was all across the board.
Regardless.
This is the way it is, right? So how do people respond to your communication style? So part of what I do is I try to identify, when I take on a client, I try to identify their communication, their behavioral style, how they respond to how people communicate to them, and also how people respond to how they communicate. So I'm curious to know how people respond to your communication style.
Yeah, that's a great question, only because sometimes I used to think that perhaps people were really taken back by me. And before we sort of jumped on to this interview, I think one of the things I said to you is I think in the past, and maybe still today, people will mistake my assertiveness for aggressiveness. Now, I don't think I'm an aggressive I think I have an aggressive mentality. I don't take no for an answer. But I wouldn't say I was an aggressive human being. I'm not out to get other people. I'm not out to do wrong by others. I do have a very kind heart. However, when I'm driven, I'm very tunnel vision, and I've been told that you're very tunnel vision. You don't sort of pop your head up and have a look what's going on. And I think that's a really good quality of an entrepreneur. But I think now, progressing through my career, and as you mentioned, some of the accolades and the things that I've done, I think people will sort of see it in a way like, okay, it makes sense that she's gotten to where she's gotten to at her age because she has that strong mindset. So it's almost coming full circle now that people that perhaps didn't quite understand me are understanding me now. And I think that as time sort of goes on, they'll probably understand me more as a human. But then I think as a child, I definitely think that, yes, I was tough too. And I didn't like people. For example, I went to an all-girls school, and I remember seeing like other girls like getting picked on by other kids. And I didn't like grow in height until after school. So I was actually quite a small human. And so I would go up to these girls like twice my size, be like, hey, why are you picking on that kid? And everyone's like, he's like small, and she's going up to this chick that was scary, that could easily like knock me out. But to me, I felt sorry for the underdog, right? I felt sorry for the person being picked on that couldn't defend themselves. And I guess I sort of grew this toughness. And people, when they first meet me, I think they wouldn't say I was mean. I think they think that, as I said, I don't hold any prisoners. I don't take any shit. I do call people on their BS. And I think depends on the person. This is why I have a lot of American friends, because they're very straight up, they're very direct. And I think other cultures as well, like Brazilians, they're very direct as well. So they sort of get along with more my culture and stuff like that. Other people who are perhaps not sure of themselves, I think they would be very, very intimidated by my communication style.
Yeah, I love that. It excites me, and I love to hear that, because I'm like, there's hope in the world. You know, it's not just like a snowflake culture. We're going to be all right, because the women, you got to understand something, right? Because the women in my culture, we're from Haiti. The women are very outspoken, very aggressive. They're classy, nice, women, feminine women and all, but they stand their own. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so, I like that though.
Yeah. And so,
I watch a lot of those American reality television shows. And like a lot of the African American women, they are like next level. Like even I'm afraid. I'm like, whoa, she's so awesome. But I like that, right? It's so like, they don't take any shit. Like they call them BS on their partners. Like it's awesome.
Yeah. Sometimes it could be a little over the top though. You know what I mean? But it's like, no, it can be. Sometimes it's like, all right, chill out. I got the point. You know what I mean? Like, but and I think that's for reality TV. But like, I think what it is, we gotta understand something, right? Women are, I think, what's the word I want to say? I think women are maybe underestimated in certain industries, right?
Yes.
And it's only recently that you start to see more women are becoming outspoken and taking on risk and are actually, doing their own thing, right? Without riding their husband's coattail or some guy's coattail or some company's coattail. It's only become recent. This is a recent thing, right? So, and I'm saying that because, I see more and more content creators that are not using femininity or sexuality or anything. They're using more common sense, logic, and practical. They're pragmatists in their way of thinking, right? Now, one thing that, and you're consistent, right? You run into the fire. You're not afraid of risk. You're pretty much, you're very outspoken. You're very direct. That's very consistent. But what's not consistent is technology. Technology moves so rapidly. It moves so fast, right? And you do have to be able to adapt to that kind of a change, right? You got to be flexible in your thinking. You got to be able to pivot at a moment's notice. These apps are constantly updating, right? So I'm wondering, for you, when did you realize, tech was something you wanted to get into? Was it in high school? Was it like in college? When did that happen?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that would be like never. I did randomly fall into it. And I remember being in year 12 and we had to fill out this form. And admittedly, like back then, technology, you'd think like the dude from high school that would come and like fix your laptop, like that was your extent of technology, which is
Right.
why what we're trying to do as an industry is change that lens. Like cybersecurity, never even heard of that. And I think that I filled out this form. And it's really interesting today when I think back, I'm like, thank gosh I'm in this space, because like I don't know what I'd do. And it's like, do you want to work with children? I'm like, no. So I don't want to be a school teacher. I don't want to do like early child stuff or anything like that, or nannying or anything like that. And it's like helping people. I'm like, I don't want to be a psychologist. I don't want to listen to people's problems. I don't want to touch people.
Right.
Like beauty and hairdressing. I'm like, oh, I don't want to touch people's hair. I don't want to touch people's faces. Like I don't want to do any of that.
Right.
And then it's like working outside. I'm like, I don't want to work in agriculture. Admittedly, I did study agriculture when I was in high school, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to work outside in the heat. I didn't want to do like horticulture. And so I got to the end of it. And I'm like, what the hell am I going to do? Like none of these things I like everyone else in school. And admittedly, the girls that I went to school with, they're like nurses and doctors and veterinarians.
Right.
And they knew that from back then, whereas I didn't. I had no clue, right? But what I knew, I didn't want to go to uni or college, as you guys would call it, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I didn't want to have a massive debt hanging over my head and put myself through 4 or 5 years worth of study that I hated. So to me, I didn't see any sort of logic behind why I'd do something like that.
Gotcha. Okay. So you never really realized you had an affinity, because that's another thing too. When I started to realize how fast, I can tell you exactly where I was when I realized this, okay? The BlackBerry had just come out. And
Yes.
it was like the second version of the BlackBerry Pearl. And I'm working 2 jobs and I'm going to school, right? I'm in college, right? I got a day job and I got a night job. And in between classes, I'm like, I'm working, right? So all the assignments were on Blackboard. Now, Blackboard was online. And I got this phone, and the internet had just started they just started putting the internet on the phone. They were talking 3G speed back then, right? So we're talking like almost ancient history, if you want to think about where we're at now, tech-wise, right? So I got this BlackBerry Pearl, and it's got the little, you know how those little phones are. They've got the little, it's not a mouse.
Thing.
Yeah, it's a little scrolly thing, and it's not touch, right? I did all my assignments for 3 out of 6 classes on my phone.
Oh my gosh.
And that was such a time saver for me, right? Now, when the phone died, though, like my battery died, or maybe I broke the phone, because I went through them a lot. I went through them pretty quick. My world ended. You know what I mean?
Of course.
My world ended. So for me, it was like, I hate technology. I can't stand it because I'm so dependent on it. And then iRobot came out.
Of course.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
iRobot came out with Will Smith, and I was like, yep, I'm with that all day. I'm going to be killing robots. That's me, right? So for you, okay, you're not really sure when you realized you wanted to get into tech, but then there was a part of you that realized.
But actually, I was just thinking, now I think about it, my brother growing up, he loved computers. So he was really into that, and gaming as well. I was into gaming a lot because I've only got one brother who's older. So I would hang out with my brother and his friends a lot. So I think I had an interest in computers, but I never thought like I'd end up like working in the field. I just could never see myself doing that.
Yeah.
So it is kind of weird that I've ended up in the field that I'm doing, but I think that's what makes your life really interesting, right?
Yeah. I'm wondering for you, was it more I'm wondering what the driver was for you. Was it, because it doesn't sound like it was necessarily tech, and just going based off what you said earlier about your personality, how you grew up, your drive, was it more taking on a new challenge? Was it more wanting to be in control of your own business? Was it more entrepreneurial driven? Like, what was it for you that made you want to get into your own business on top of that?
So how I got into cybersecurity originally, I was working at Commonwealth Bank, which is the largest bank in Australia and 10th largest bank in the world. So I was working in an IT department.
Right.
But I found that a little boring. It wasn't as fast paced. But then I started to get into the whole, who runs all of the hacking team and who like looks into the security side of it. And then I just got really interested. I started asking questions to the CISO at the time, which is the Chief Information Security Officer. And then he was like, the fact that you're asking those questions and you got that level of curiosity, that to me is really good in terms of the right approach to cybersecurity. Because if you're not asking questions in this space,
right,
you're not probably going to be the right caliber of person to think outside of the box. And so one of the things that really drew me to it originally was, well, how come all these people can go around and like credit card skim or steal money out of people's accounts or steal people's identities. Like, why are these people doing that? And I was really interested in the crime aspect of it, of like why people did what they did. And I'm still very curious today in terms of, so I think in terms of how people operate. So I guess that sort of sparked my curiosity into, well, I'm really interested in this space because I'm interested in how people think and why people do things.
Yeah. So cybersecurity, that's really where you found yourself, right? It's like you bypassed, it's like you bypassed, that entry level of understanding technology itself. And then you went straight into, that's what happened. Yeah. Like you went straight into the dynamics, the inner dynamics of what drives technology, what keeps technology relevant, right? Which is the cybersecurity. Yeah. So walk me through that process. Like, what was that learning curve like for you?
It was really exciting. I think because I was like, oh wow, like, I was a reporting analyst was my first role, and I kind of got to this view of this bird's eye perspective of looking at the cybersecurity division of what that looked like to an executive. And so I think that in terms of learning the stuff that I did back then has really helped me in the work I do day to day, because it got me to understand what's important to an executive, what type of language we need to use, how to create that narrative, create a story, all of those types of things. Because a lot of these people that are investing in these products and services and the team are not from that background.
Right.
And so that's where I could see that there was a disconnect. And I think that's helped shape the business that I'm in today, because a lot of people that in terms of cybersecurity companies don't understand that people that are predominantly buying this stuff are either really senior, they don't understand the nuts and bolts of how this technology works or how these services operate.
Yeah.
But it's more about an outcome. So I guess to me, I could see that there was that massive disconnect. And it's hard because unless you've worked in this field before, you're not going to really understand the nuances, how it operates, the language, people's mindset, how people are, because they are a very different type of people. So you do need to understand them at the coalface to be able to interpret what a lot of these people in these companies do as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you have two types of people, right? When it comes to the workforce, you've got your entrepreneur and then you've got your entrepreneurs, right? Now you've got big business and then you've got small business, right? So you hit a gold mine, you found a disconnect. And instead of, I think what it sounds like to me is like when you found the disconnect, did you start exploring, right, how you can try to bridge a gap and then try to share that with the company and then help the company grow? And at some point go out on your own? Or was it like, oh, I've got the gold mine here, I'm just going to go out and start my own thing? Like how'd that process go for you? How'd you step into the entrepreneurship side of it?
Yeah, I don't think it was as clear cut as that. I wish it was. I think so after I left the bank, I did a few other roles to other consulting firms, and I was trying to find what was right for me. I had tried corporate, that wasn't right for me. I tried consulting and then sales. That wasn't right for me, any of those things. I hated sales.
Right.
And so then I kind of got jack of everything. I was going through a lot of my life at the time. So I thought, I had a whole bunch of cash saved up. So I thought, well, I'm just going to quit my job. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I was having discussions with other companies potentially coming on board to help them with a bit of work as a contractor. So nothing too set in stone. And then I think I started to do reconnaissance work around what do people actually need. And I know it sounds obvious when it's like, do your research before you start a company. But believe it or not, a lot of companies in technology fail because they don't. They think, oh, well, I'm going to create this amazing thing with all these bells and whistles, but then no one actually wants that in reality, right?
Yeah, preach. Yeah, you're preaching right now, because R&D, people don't understand how important R&D is from inception. It's not something you do later on when you start making money. If you don't have the target audience and you don't know what the marketplace needs, you got no reason being in business. You're just wasting your time, you're wasting your money. So R&D should start at the very beginning phase, right? And that's what it sounds like where you are at, right?
And admittedly, I wasn't doing as quite mathematical. I was probably a bit more anecdotal in my approach, but I knew that I had worked enough to understand where those gaps were. Right. And that's when I started to almost put the pieces together. So it's not like one day I woke up and like, yes, this is what I was going to do. Because at the time I was writing a blog, because when I was working in the consulting firm, part of my role was, you had to sell the consulting services and all that type of stuff. But for me, I didn't like working in sales. And I remember trying to cold call someone up, which admittedly doesn't work. I got
Right.
rejected clearly.
Right.
And I thought, well, I want this to be a better way. I don't want to go out to people, and you lose the power then. When people come to you, you have more power then in what you're trying to sell.
Nice.
So I thought, well, this was back in 2016. So this wasn't that long ago, to be honest with you.
Right.
And I started thinking, well, if I can drive influence, perhaps people will approach me and I'll remove the whole negative connotation of selling and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And I started writing a blog. Admittedly, it was not the best blog, but I started to develop it to, again, as I mentioned before, get other people on in terms of their stories and their theories and their thoughts,
Right.
and then they'd share it with their network and et cetera, et cetera. So it's that same OPM model.
Right. I like
and
that.
then I was consistent back then. So I think I was writing like one blog a month or something super small, right?
Right.
Then I started to do more research around, well, this is really effective. There were some people doing it at the time, but not really.
Yeah.
And so I decommissioned that and started up the KBI brand. And then again, just started to put the pieces together to be like, this is what people need. And what ultimately came out of that was, one part of the KBI is a Marcoms agency that specializes in cybersecurity in terms of helping organizations and startups to better communicate their message, distill down what they do in terminology that people are going to understand,
Right.
and do their marketing for them effectively as a service. The other side of that, which is the other part that I realized as well that was missing, was getting that cybersecurity awareness out there in a modern approach.
Right.
And getting people like yourself to understand why it's important. That was missing. So that's why we've got the podcast aimed at the executive level, to get a synthesized viewpoint of what's happening in the industry versus, again, getting into the nuts and bolts of how things operate.
Yeah.
And so that was a process.
Yeah.
And I would say in any business, you're still going to pivot and change because you are getting that feedback from clients or people in the industry. And I think people who are ignorant into listening to their clients or people in their field are not going to grow as rapidly as they'd like to, because they're not actually listening to the people that are on the ground absorbing the content or the services that are going to give you that direct feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. You hit it right on the head. You hit it right on the head. So essentially what you did was you identified a unique value proposition, right? You identified a particular niche, right? You cornered your market to a part where this is exactly what you need. How am I going to get the messaging out to let people know this is exactly what they need before they even know they need it, right? And that's really what you did. And what you run into is like what you just said. You have a lot of people who are a little bit resistant to the change, and they're resistant to receiving the information, and they got to learn the hard way through experience, right?
Yep.
And that's usually probably when they reach back out and they're like, and you're like, oh, I told you so. I'm going to hold it, right?
It happens.
Yeah. And you're like, you got that I
Yep.
told you so moment, but then some people have to go through that to learn the hard way, right?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. So I can see that also, and a lot of different businesses, I see that. And it's, I think it takes time, that learning curve. Not everybody wants to adapt to the change. And a lot of times that they can't afford to pay, right, for that level of service, that level of you've nuanced it. You've got it down to such a nuance that you can pretty much anticipate and manage expectations as you go along, right? Because of your foresight, right? So what I'm wondering is about what are some things like right now that you see going on in cybersecurity that, as we're going into virtualizing and digitizing our businesses, that we should be on a lookout for so that we could probably be more effective, right?
I think the first thing that I'd like to say is I think people think that if they're not in technology or they don't know enough about it, that they're exempt from potentially being compromised or attacked. And that is fundamentally not true. I think anyone who has a phone, any social profile, any sort of online banking, you potentially could be at risk of having anything happen to you. So I think this whole, well, I'm not in it, therefore I don't need to understand it, is wrong. And I think I keep trying to tell people that just because you don't work in this day to day doesn't mean that you potentially are not going to be targeted. And I think that as we grow as a society, because more businesses operate online, they operate virtually, they do all of their business banking online, they've got social media accounts, it means that everything's online. So if everything's online, if you look at an attack surface, that's how attackers are going to start targeting people. It's easier. We're chatting through halfway across the world.
Right.
So it means that a cyber criminal, they don't need to live in Sydney to go and hack my account. They could be in the middle of wherever. It doesn't really matter. And I think it's because as you said, around like crime, like it's because more businesses now operate online, which means that crime is now online then as well.
Yeah.
And I think like back in the day, people would rob banks. Like, why would you rob a bank? Like
Right.
the money, they don't store money there. Like,
Right.
and if they do, it's not much.
Right.
If you were to like steal something, you would try to siphon it out of the bank through various means. I've seen it happen before. I used to report on the numbers for the bank in terms of this does happen. It's real. It exists. It's growing because, again, everyday people don't understand like credit card skimming, like cover your PIN when you take money out and all basic stuff like that, which opens up a whole can of worms in terms of an attack vector on how a cyber criminal could potentially get through.
Right.
So I think that when you look at it like that, it's going to be ever evolving because we operate always online and we're going to continue to stay that way for the foreseeable.
Right. Should I open my cookies? Every time I go to a different website, I get cookies. I get a message from cookies and it's like, oh, we just want to see how we can help you. And I should accept cookies. And I'm like, well, now that I look into it, what I'm finding out now, what's happening is the deal that just happened, for instance, with TikTok and Oracle, right? It was a data deal, right? It was like, who owns your data? You know what I mean? And I think that's where we're at right now, where we're not sure who actually owns our data. And that's something that I don't know, too much about, but I the more I like look into it, I think it's understandable. But then there are some things that we could do as like, regular people, right? That we can probably set ourselves up better to not have, our data just readily available like that, right? So Oracle, I guess, partnering with TikTok is like one example, or cookies popping up on the windows whenever I open up a new window is another example. Jeff Bezos with Amazon and like what is it, Alexa, right? That's always listening, and he uses that information, for his consumer obsession, right? It's like, what can I do besides unplugging everything to make sure that my data is safe, right?
Look, that's a really tough one. I think now, because when the internet sort of came around, we didn't really have any rules, right? So if you drive a car and you speed, you're going to get penalized, whereas no one could sort of envision like the problems that we have today. So it's kind of hard to try to retrofit some type of controls around, well, how do we get it back? It's hard. I think that not a lot of people really see the value in their data, for example. So there was a lady I interviewed on my podcast, and she had conducted a report around, well, do Australians really care about their privacy and data? Long story short, the answer was no, and it's because they don't value it as much, right? And so I think in terms of accepting cookies and stuff like that, it's going to really depend on the website. You could potentially opt for just you could use a VPN, or you could use like more of a private browser in terms of trying to remove like cookies, and then if you've got like the targeted advertising and stuff like that. But then I look at it the other way, and I'm trying to just be really open here and be like a human and try to think about not as a security professional, but as a consumer.
Right.
I would rather have ads targeted to me than like stuff about phishing that like I hate.
Right.
You know what I mean? So for me, it's a double-edged sword. So it's like, you don't want to give off too much because you don't want to have stuff that you don't like targeting you that you don't care about. But then it's like, oh, well, they know so much about me. And I think that, like you said, there's no real way to get around it because everyone's using it. So it's hard. And I'm not saying just because everyone uses it, you should use it as well. But I think you've got to do your due diligence in terms of, well, if I go ahead and do this, like, what does this actually mean for me? But I don't think a lot of people think like this. Right. And in terms of TikTok, there was a huge uproar about it in the market. We're writing an article in terms of what this actually means for people. But again, it comes down to that whole, well, everyone else is on it. It means that like I must be on it then as well. Yeah. And I think there was a study done actually in New York City where Times Square, they did the study, like one guy started staying there and looking at nothing. Yeah. And then like another guy came in, then he started looking. Next thing there was like 5 people in. All of a sudden, this whole thing, there was like 50 people looking at nothing, right? Because nothing draws a crowd like a crowd. So TikTok was famous because everyone's talking about it. You know, you got Gary Vaynerchuk talking about being on it, blah, 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 blah. Then all of a sudden everyone's on it, right? Yeah. So that's how people are a herd mentality. People want to do what everyone else does. No one wants to be a lone ranger and like try to go out on their own and do their own thing against what everyone else is doing. People want to fit in. So that's why a lot of these platforms do get people in quite quickly because everyone's doing it. It must be the in thing. It must be cool. And I want to keep up with the trends. So there's some element to it that's kind of bad in a sense because people aren't thinking about what's right for them. That is following what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
But in terms of like day-to-day stuff, I think just have two-factor authentication to ensure, like if someone were to, I don't know, brute force your account, for example, you would have your phone nearby to potentially prevent that type of attack because they wouldn't have access to your phone. That's number one. Long passwords, so it's not so hard to break into because the number one password still around the globe is password one. And attackers know that, so they can write scripts pretty quickly to brute force accounts. I think the other thing as well is even like basic stuff. So like people when they're flying business class on like Instagram or something, like they've got all their information on there. So like just be careful about what you post online in terms of like people can use that as research to potentially steal your identity or do like more targeted attacks in terms of like not only overtaking your identity, but also potentially doing a massive attack in terms of like compromising on your bank, and they know everything about you then. So it's really hard to get away from that. And so it's just small things like that. And the reason why people don't do this is because originally we didn't have to do this to this level in terms of protecting ourselves online. It didn't really exist then. Like the internet only came out in the 90s. So this is still a new thing and the rules aren't written yet. And because it's growing so exponentially, it's hard enough for cybersecurity practitioners to keep up. So it's just basic stuff like that. So it's more about the mentality of, well, if this got into the hands of a cyber criminal, what could go wrong? I guarantee you 9 people out of 10 wouldn't think like that. And the only reason why I think people in my life care is because I talk about it so much. Or they know that I'm in the field.
Well, yeah, I think that's a fact, right? Because I don't think about it so much myself, and I honestly don't care about my data. I feel like I really don't. I'm like I'm not doing anything crazy. You know what I mean? Like I'm not that sophisticated. I'm not a hacker. It's like I don't really care. I don't watch porn on my computer or something like. So I don't really care. All I do is Google searches, and like you said, the ads that are like directed towards me, they show up pretty fast. So I'm like, okay, that's creepy, right? Because I'll be like in Facebook or something, and then I get an ad. I mean, I'm looking for a couch. I'm looking for like, a battery for my car or something. So they show up like right on Facebook as soon as I get off that site. That's creepy, right? But nothing crazy. So I get where you're coming from. So where do you see, I guess, cybersecurity in like 3-5 years from now? Is it something that can be completely digitized? And do you see yourself being replaced by a robot, or like your business kind of being replaced by a robot or automation in any way?
No, not really. I think there's so much talks like, we're going to be replaced by robots. But I think like if you go back in time to like back in the day when people were blacksmiths, effectively they've been replaced now by other jobs and careers. So it's not like we're replacing them. We're actually evolving as a society. Like, yes, okay, Google and Facebook and Amazon, all these players that are out there, but they've actually generated jobs for people. This is my belief, because if we're just going to stay the same, we're not really evolving as a society. And so for me, yes, there's going to be jobs that become obsolete or your skills become atrophied, but it's about keeping up with the times. Because if you go back even like 100 years ago or whatever, the first car came out, like that wasn't even a thing back then, right? So you can't sit there and blame like Mercedes because they brought cars out. It just means that we're growing and we're evolving. So for me, to answer your question, no, I don't think that that'll be the case. I think that cybersecurity, and as I gave a presentation to a college the other day, was about you need to constantly upskill, you need to learn. Just because you do a degree doesn't mean it's one and done, this is it, this is the end of the line. No, I think there are industries out there that are becoming automated. So like legal clerks, I think accounting and finance, that is becoming automated. But I think once these jobs are automated, it actually means that very rudimentary skill sets, people will have to force themselves to level up. So as a whole world, which means that we're going to increase the caliber of people because people aren't doing very basic jobs. So I would say that's a good thing. But then I think secondly as well, because these other jobs are being automated, or however you want to describe it, it means that other jobs are then going to open up, and it's going to give people time to create more jobs that perhaps we didn't know. And it's hard because we're not I don't know, we can't see into the future. When you look back, it's like, oh, well, that was obvious that someone created Uber. Well, it wasn't back then.
Right.
So I think in 5 years, if we revisit this podcast and we're like, oh, well, the things that are out now, like we had no idea. It's because the future isn't really written yet. And it's hard to give that insight around, well, what could potentially happen in the future and how does that implicate me?
Right. Love it. Love it. Love it. I get fired up listening to you talk because it's so practical. And I'm like, you know what? It is scary. It is evolving rapidly, but the more you simplify it, the less threatening it seems, especially the automating side of it, because a lot of people are afraid. You know, what's crazy is like the trucks that are able to drive themselves. That's incredible.
Yes.
Right? That's
in mining, there's a lot of those as well.
Yeah, that's incredible too. But a lot of people died from mining. So it's like, you know what? That should be something that goes automated, right? We should be able to figure that out, right? Where's KB like 3-5 years from now? Are you coming to the States or what? We need you out here.
No, absolutely. Like, it's funny because I know that, the work that you do is a lot of coaching and like personal development. It's definitely been one of my goals. So I was going to try to travel there this year, but then COVID happened. So it's always been a very big goal of mine. I think that, I don't know, like, as you can see, like there's a New York, like painting in the background. I've always had this like fascination. I love New York when I went there. The US for me, I love the mentality there. And what I love about the US, like there's this hustle thing, right? Like, you don't get the same help in the US as you do in Australia. Like, for example, if you don't have a job in Australia, you're still going to live off like welfare and government. You're still going to have money. In the US, it's like no one cares, right? Like you got to hustle. So for me, that goes with my mentality because like so many people in Australia, we can live in a really sheltered place.
Right.
That's like other places of the world don't operate like this. And I know that, healthcare, for example, like if you can't afford healthcare in Australia, you get healthcare. You may have to go on a waiting list, but you're still going to get the help that you need. That is not what it is in the US, right? And your healthcare system is like crazy expensive.
Well, it's a source of contention right now in the White House. So
exactly. But I'm saying that like there's this different mindset about the US in terms of like, if I don't do this, like I'm done, right?
You're going to die. Gone. You're going to die.
You know what I mean? But in Australia, it's like, she'll be right, mate. I'll do it tomorrow. And I was speaking to this other guy. He's like Sri Lankan guy living in Australia, but he was talking about India. And because I went there, it's a hustle mentality too. Like he's giving this example, and I know this firsthand. He was like, this guy had to write this proposal, and he goes, if he had to stay back till 2 a.m. because if he didn't do it, the next dude was up to get the job, right? He was up. So in Australia, it doesn't work like that. So for me, because I am very like hustle mentality, I think that's what's worked in my favor. So I think that I would fit in fine in the US because everyone's like this chick is like next level. In terms of like the very focused and driven. So I would say that's definitely on the cards. We do have a lot of US based clients that have found me through LinkedIn and various other sort of social media platforms. But I think for me, that is 100% on the cards because I love the culture there. I love the people. And I think that when I went there, like people were really nice to me. They're like, oh, you're an Australian. Like, that's so nice. And that's so cool.
Right.
So this whole like fallacy that like Americans are like rude. I've never, no.
You're just, KB, you're one of us. You're just living in Australia.
I know. I don't get that though. People just say, oh, Americans are so rude. And I'm like, no, I don't get that. I never found that. I think they don't understand them enough. And in New York in particular, like, I don't know, that movie was like, I'm walking here if someone like bumps into you. Right. I know I didn't experience that when I've been to New York in my time, but I think it probably does happen. It's because there's so many people there. They're doing their own thing. So unless it directly impacts them, they're not interested. And to me, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah, I can't wait for you to come to the States. Whenever you come to the States, let me know, right?
No, 100%, man. I will.
Because we need you out here for sure. Just the whole idea of the entrepreneurial grind and the way I see that you display your content and you call bullshit when you do, and the way you break it down, I think, listen, that is something that, it could be an international influence. you have such a good, approach to what you're doing and how you're doing and simplifying it, right? So let's play a quick game, right, before we wrap up. I learned so much from you, and I can't wait to learn more in the future, right? Quick game. We call it hands down, the lightning round, okay?
Okay.
I give you 3 topics, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't want to give me your, all right, so I give you 3 topics. You give me your bottom line about each topic, okay? Your truth,
Okay.
all right? Now, if you don't want to talk about this topic, just say pass. I'll move on to the next one, okay?
Okay.
All right.
I'm nervous.
I promise. It won't be that crazy. Okay, so the first topic, living in a cashless society. Would you be the kind of person to just, adapt to that change, or would you be hoarding cash?
100% adapt. Yep, it's better. It means people are going to be more accountable. There's more visibility. And I think that it'll help. Like a lot of people do like under the cash table deals. So it means that like they're not being taxed effectively, right? If it's all cashless, it's all digitized, there's records of it. So to me, I think that's a good thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Love it. Digital currency or going back to the gold standard, which do you think would be how you would roll?
Digital currency. I'm sick of this conversion stuff. It does my head in. I think that we like this whole like global thing. It's like, well, I think everyone's global because everyone's on the internet, right? I think it would just make things easier, and I think it would actually open up more terms of trade and increase deal flow.
Okay. Love it. Love it. Okay. And the last one, being an entrepreneur or going out and taking the risk and becoming a full-fledged entrepreneur.
I think that's an obvious one.
Yeah.
Definitely the latter. Full-fledged entrepreneur, go hard, go home. I think you only live once, right? So for me, I don't want to sit there doing stuff I hate. I don't want to be around people I don't like. I don't want to regret one day. And admittedly, you're going to make mistakes, but making a mistake is when you learn. And I think that I don't think I've really waited or hesitated or been apprehensive. I just do stuff.
Right.
And for me, I think the longer that you sit there and you analyze, you talk yourself out of it. So you just do it, and you don't give yourself time to think about what you're going to do, and then you experience it.
Yeah, and course correct along the way, right?
Oh, 100%. Like no one's got it right, but like if you actually went through like, I don't know, Jeff Bezos or someone's whole career, like he's made a lot of mistakes, but that doesn't define who he is as a person, right? Like everyone does. Like he's still a human being at the end of the day. And as much as like we talk about computers not making mistakes, they absolutely do. So we're not all programmed in a way where it's so linear. It's going to go up and down. It's not going to. Nothing can ever consistently go up.
Yeah, it's really consistent with what you said before about it not being so binary, and you learning that later on in life, right? So it's like these little gray areas, right? That's pretty consistent, right? And finally, what is your bottom line, Karissa? Right? That reoccurring truth for you that serves as rocket fuel, that no matter what, in terms of any setback that you might be faced with, you use this truth to propel you forward. What is that for you? What's your bottom line?
Oh, I got a lot, but I think going back to my dad, he just said, never, ever, 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 ever give up. So I always say, until the day I die, I'm never going to give up. So even if I fail multiple times, I'm never going to accept giving up, because to me, giving up is when you give in. So giving up is never going to be an option, because I don't see that as a way forward.
Love it. Love it. I love it. Never give up. Just keep going, right? Keep going. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Never give up. Never. I can't, that would go against my personality if I did. So for me, I can't. I don't think I could sleep at night if I was like, oh, I just gave up on that. To me, I'd feel like a failure.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah. Well, there it
is.
I
really appreciate it, JJ.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Listen, where do people find you?
Yeah, predominantly people find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, Karissa Breen, or I am Karissa Breen on Twitter. That's where most people would hit me up. So yeah, really appreciate the chat. Learning a little bit more about yourself. And yeah, just your mentality, I think, is very similar to mine. So I really appreciate that.
Definitely. It was a lot of fun. I'm still learning from you. I'm still following you on LinkedIn. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, this is Karissa Breen, KBI, out in Sydney, Australia, right? I have a reason to go to Sydney, Australia now. I got to get there before she comes to the States. That's my mental challenge right now. All right. Definitely. All right. So this
Love
was,
it.
this was the Bottom Line podcast where we say what we mean and we mean what we say, because at the core of everything that is, was, and forever will be, there will always be the bottom line.